Most everyone has heard the expression, pride comes before a fall. It is one of those well-known bits of wisdom that has been around for years and years. In fact, more years than you may have realized, for it is based on one of the verses from the book of Proverbs that Pam just read. The verse is what scholars call a poetic parallelism, or a proverb pair. First, the author writes, "Pride goes before destruction." Then the author essentially repeats himself, yet using different words, "and a haughty spirit before a fall." Mash them together and you get the more familiar, pride comes before a fall. It is, of course, true. When we are haughty, when we think we know it all, when we feel we are in control and nothing and no one can get in our way, we are bound to trip and fall. To think so highly of oneself, to think that way of your own person, was deemed a sin in the Middle Ages. In fact, one of the deadly sins, right up there with gluttony and sloth. I'm reminded of the preacher who was greeting parishioners at the door after service, the way we preachers do. Most said, "Good morning," or "Nice service." But one man paused and said, "You know, Pastor, that was some sermon. You must be smarter than Einstein." The preacher puffed up with pride. "Why, thank you," he said. All week he walked around with a head bigger than all outdoors. But then he got thinking about it and wondered just why the man had said he was smarter than the great scientist from Princeton. So the following Sunday, when the parishioner came through the line, he asked him, "Why'd you say that?" "Well," replied the man, "they say only 10 people were smart enough to truly understand Einstein, but Pastor, when you preach, no one can understand." Ah, yes, the dangers of pride. But hold on a minute. Pride can indeed be a real character flaw, a sin, if you will, but pride can also be a good thing. In fact, Webster has several definitions of pride, two of which appear to be in direct contradiction of each other. Pride, according to the first definition, is inordinate self-esteem or conceit. The second, though, is quite different. Pride, a reasonable or justifiable self-respect. In the first instance, pride is obviously something to be avoided. Thinking too highly of yourself, being conceited, can indeed lead to all sorts of problems. But in the second, pride appears to be something that we should all strive for. It is good to have a well-considered amount of self-respect. In fact, psychologists tell us that having self-respect is the very foundation for being able to respect anybody else. You have to love yourself first if you want to love other people. So it is that we find various groups of people talking about being proud. The Army promotes being Army proud. The civil rights movement has been fueled in part by black pride. And in recent years, the newly won rights of gay and lesbian persons have grown out of gay pride. None of these involve conceit or an inordinate amount of self-esteem. It doesn't mean thinking soldiers are better than anyone else. It doesn't mean African Americans are superior to whites. It's not about gay and lesbian women considering themselves better than straight folks. It's something else altogether. Pride involves at least three things. Pride means knowing who you are. Pride means accepting who you are. And pride means being grateful for who you are. Knowing who you are, accepting who you are, being grateful for who you are. Having pride in who you are is to be unashamed of the person you were created to be. It is knowing, accepting, and being grateful for the gift of personhood that God gave you, and only you. This past week, as some of you know, I took my mother on a trip to Kansas. Now, you may wonder, why Kansas? Is he having an Oz fit or something? And you especially may wonder why Kansas in August. And there is a reason. You see, my mother, who is a retired English professor, loves books, all kinds of books. She lives in a rather small house in southeastern Kentucky. It just has 2 bedrooms, but she also has a whole room set aside as her personal library, lined with bookshelves filled with literally thousands of volumes. She buys all kinds of books and reads them too. Used books, old books, paperbacks, hardcovers, titles just published and titles published hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Her very favorite place to buy books is a store in Wichita, Kansas, a store called Eighth Day Books. They produce a catalog which is rather eclectic, and she loves to pick out a book based on their reviews and then order it. But for all her great love of Eighth Day Books, my mother had never been there. "Maybe you could take me there someday," she said in a conversation that we had on the phone this spring. I'm a good son. And that's why I took her to Kansas in August. I was doing a lot of thinking about this pride issue, knowing that I had to preach this morning while we were on that trip. And I realized I'd had at least 3 different experiences that illustrate my point. One of our stops on the trip was Independence, Missouri. There we visited the Mormon Visitors Center. In case you don't know or remember your Mormon history, Independence was one of the major stops on the Mormon trek westward as they made their way to Salt Lake City. In fact, when they got to Independence, those early Mormons fully expected to stay there and make it their home. But in time, they were driven out by governmental edict and mob violence. Reciting Mormon history, though, is not the point of this story. When we entered the Visitors Center, I was immediately greeted by a very charming young woman who thrust out her hand to shake mine and introduced herself as Sister Crockett. I resisted making some crack about coonskin caps, and really was glad that I did, because she and another young woman who introduced herself as Sister Muniz served as my tour guides through the exhibit. I made it very clear that I am a church historian and an ordained minister in another denomination, and that I have absolutely no interest in becoming a Mormon. But that didn't faze them, not one bit. They were sweet and kind. I would call them gentle souls, yet very committed to giving me the whole message. They quoted from the Bible and the Book of Mormon. They spoke of their own commitment to their work as Mormon missionaries, and they shared some history with me. Sister Crockett and Sister Muniz knew who they were and who they are. Young Mormon women with a mission. No doubt they were proud, in the best sense of that word, to be members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I couldn't help but be impressed and wished that more of us were as forthcoming with who we are. While we were in Independence, we also stopped at the Truman Presidential Library and Museum and toured that facility. It was fascinating, and it all happened in my mother's lifetime. What a treat to be there with her. When we passed an exhibit of newspaper front pages, we stopped in front of a copy of the New York Times edition printed in April of 1945. Roosevelt dead, it said in huge type. Truman takes oath. My mother teared up as she remembered how her father had come tearing into the house after work that day and practically shouted, "Turn on the radio. Roosevelt died." The Truman exhibit also reminded me of the importance of pride, in both senses of the word. One of the exhibits was all about the Korean War, and in it, the story of General MacArthur's firing by Truman. That tale was all about pride. For MacArthur and his public insistence that we must invade China, despite Truman's orders to the contrary, didn't accept who he was. Yes, he was a general. Yes, he was in command of much, but he was a general under the command of a civilian president. And he forgot that reality or ignored it. And in his case, pride did indeed come before a fall. And the bookstore, the main reason for the trip. It's a lovely old house that has been turned into a 3-story facility. Children's books in the basement, literature, C.S. Lewis books, books of literary criticism, liturgical books, and all manner of icons on the main floor. The main floor sort of, for me, was like dying and going to heaven. My mother, it wasn't sort of like, it was. And on the 3rd floor, history, philosophy, science, art, biblical studies. I had called ahead and given the owner a heads up about our visit. He was astounded that we would travel all that way just to visit his bookstore. When we met him, he was such a gracious human being. He told us to pick out whatever books as we wanted, as many as we planned to buy, and then they would ship them to us free of charge. He gave each of us a beautiful ceramic mug with the shop's logo on the front. And Mother was given a book that had been written in celebration of the shop's 25th anniversary. Warren, that's the owner's name, Warren seems to understand that he has a real treasure in his bookstore. It is clearly a labor of love. He is proud of it, and he is grateful. Grateful to be the owner of a bookshop that brought an 82-year-old retired English professor and her 62-year-old pastor's son literally halfway across the nation to buy a few books. You see what I mean? All sorts of pride on my trip. What a wonder. Yes, pride can come before a fall. If it is conceit, if it is inordinate self-esteem, pride is not a good thing. But pride can also be a blessing if it means knowing who you are, if it means accepting who you are. And perhaps most importantly, pride can be a blessing if you are grateful for being yourself. And while I may not be as smart as Einstein, I am smart enough to know who and what I am. I'm smart enough to know who and what you are. And I'm smart enough to be grateful for the simple fact that black or white, gay or straight, military or civilian, bookstore owner, professor or pastor, we are all children of God. And of that, we can and should be proud. Amen.